What's up and welcome to another episode of GizmoSlipTech. Today we're going to be comparing gaming laptops in a spectrum of prices, and today we're going to find out how each of these laptops performs when playing PUBG. For this Acer Nitro 5, we're dealing with a quad-core i5-8300H GTX 1050 graphics card, which is going to perform admirably in many titles at 1080p. It's got a backlit keyboard, IPS display, a plethora of excellent ports. This thing has a 1 terabyte standard hard drive, so it's gonna be really slow. It's gonna be very interesting to see how it performs today. Stepping up to the Dell G7, the processor on this bad boy is an i7-8750H. IPS display, a GTX 1060 Max Q. This is their gaming focused budget lineup. This guy was purchased for $1,079. Moving on to the Razer Blade 15, actually the smallest 15-inch gaming laptop out there right now. It features an i7-8750H and a GTX 1070 Max Q, 16 gigs of RAM, 512 gig SSD, gorgeous backlit keyboard, 100% sRGB, 144 Hz display, and this guy retails for right around $2,000, but depending on the model you get, this particular model retails for right around $25.99. Moving on to the Auris X9. This thing features the most powerful laptop processor currently available. It's the i9-8950HK. This thing is capable out of the box of overclocking to 4.3 gigahertz, and you can also overclock the graphics card that comes inside right out of the box just using your command center. It's got a GTX 1080 in it, which is the most powerful graphics card that you can get in a laptop to date. It features a full mechanical backlit keyboard for a great typing experience, a 144 Hz very colorful display that matches the Razer Blade's quality, and of course it has a 1 terabyte SSD and 32 gigs of RAM, so it is definitely the king in literally all of the possible specs out of all of these laptops. This Auris X9 retails for $3,900, and depending on where you buy it, you may have to pay for shipping or tax, so it could very well go above $4,000. Without further ado, let's get to testing these machines. Now, these are the settings that we use when recording the PUBG benchmarks because these are the optimal settings for competitive play. So we filmed all of these results with an external camera so we would not influence the performance of these laptops at all. Now, when you look at these numbers at the top, you have the top line being the graphics card's temperature, usage, and the clock speed of that graphics card. The second line is the CPU temperature, usage, and clock speed. And the third line has the current frames per second as well as the average frames per second. Now, the tricky part about PUBG is that when you're in a city or looking at a large city, your frames per second is going to be very limited by the performance of your CPU. But when you're in rural environments, the game is very GPU bound. This benchmark of the city of Yasna is what I use as my standard test to determine the lowest potential performance inside of PUBG. Typically speaking, you're going to get much higher frames per second. The Acer Nitro is struggling here. You can see at 48 frames per second average, while the Dell G7 is hitting 66 frames per second, which is solid. Now, the Acer Nitro and Dell G7 have 60 Hz displays, while the Razer Blade and Auris X9 have 144 Hz displays. So with the first two laptops, our goal is to get at least 60 frames per second, while the goal with the two more expensive laptops is to hit 144 frames per second, which is actually the maximum possible frames per second that you can get inside of PUBG. You can really tell the difference between the quad-core processor of the Acer Nitro and the other three laptops. The Acer Nitro's usage is at 43%, while the other three laptops are in the 20% category, and that's because they have 6-core processors. As a general rule, anything below 85 degrees is okay, but ideally, in my opinion, you want to have a CPU temp of 75 degrees or less. It's only when you hit around the 90 to 100 degree mark that you'll actually be thermally throttled. For PUBG, it's very important to have a very powerful CPU and GPU if you want to maintain a consistent and high frame rate. The important thing to keep in mind here with the Dell G7 and Razer Blade is that there's not that big of a difference, with only an approximate 20% performance difference between the 1060 and the 1070. Normally, there's a bigger performance gap here, and that's because the Razer Blade is being limited by its CPU. Otherwise, the GTX 1070 would actually be putting out more frames in this situation. Now, the important thing to note with PUBG PUBG is that I had a 9 frames per second increase just by overclocking the CPU up to 4.7 gigahertz, which really goes to show you how much PUBG can be CPU bound when looking at a city. This next test is running down the street in the city of Yasuna as well. You can see that the Dell G7 is getting even closer to the Razer Blade with only about a 10 frames per second difference between the two of them. The Auris X9 is absolutely killing this test. It is averaging 116 frames per second, which is absolutely amazing. The Acer Nitro, on the other hand, is barely unable to hit that 60 frames per second. Now, this next test is in the city of Los Leones on the Miramar continent, which is quite a bit more optimized than the original PUBG map. Once again, you can see the CPU temps for the Razer Blade and the Acer Nitro are on the high side, but overall the temps for all of these laptops are well within reason. You can see the Acer Nitro did quite well with this test, averaging over 60 frames per second at 64 FPS. The Dell G7 has a massive jump up to 89 FPS. The Razer Blade managed 108 FPS, while the Auris X9 killed it at 129 frames per second. Now, one thing to keep in mind with the Auris X9 is that the average would definitely be higher if the frame rate cap could be raised above 144 frames per second. You can see with the Acer Nitro 5, we're getting solid GPU temperatures at 72 degrees pretty much consistently. Well, with that CPU, we're hitting upwards of 85 degrees, which is not ideal because we definitely don't want to go much higher than that, as we will reach thermal throttling. Overall, you could definitely play some good games of PUBG on the Acer Nitro 5, but if it was me, I would lower a couple of the settings so that I could hit consistently above 60 frames per second. Taking a look at the Dell G7, we're seeing great temperatures with the GPU only hitting 66 degrees and the CPU hitting 69 degrees. That is fantastic. Because the GPU is a max-Q GPU, it is just running exceptionally cool. Taking a look at the Razer, we're seeing 73 degrees Celsius on the GPU and 83 degrees on the CPU. That is not the best. I wish they were a little bit lower. As far as performance, we're getting great boost clocks on the GPU, but the CPU is going up and down, staying right around 3.5 gigahertz. Taking a look at the Auris X9, this thing is absolutely destroying PUBG. We've got 75 degrees on the GPU and right around 70 to 71 degrees on the CPU. That is right in line with ideal temps for a gaming laptop. Taking a look at the boost clocks, we're getting 1911 megahertz on the GPU, and that is absolutely fantastic. Most GTX 1080s hover closer to the 1850 megahertz mark. On top of that, the CPU is locking in at a consistent 4.3 gigahertz. Now, we have taken all the tests that we did for each laptop and averaged their frames per second. You can see the Acer Nitro 5 managed 63 frames per second. The Dell G7 hit 94 frames per second. The Razer Blade 15 hit 105. And the Auris X9 managed 120. Now, the thing to keep in mind here with the Razer Blade 15 and the Auris X9 is that they are going to hit the frame cap pretty often, and that is going to skew their average frames per second. There's nothing we can do about this since the frame cap is established by PUBG, but just so you know, the frames per second would actually be higher here if we were able to raise that. One thing that's nice about those frame caps is that even if we were rendering above 144 frames per second, we wouldn't even see those extra frames since the displays cap out at 144 hertz anyway. And now we get to the coup de grace. What is the PUBG frame per dollar rate for each of these laptops? We have 1035 for the Nitro 5, 1147 for the Dell G7. Both of these laptops are being budget gaming laptops, are absolutely superb dollar to frame rate ratios, while the Razer Blade 15 and Auris X7 are quite a bit more premium at $24.75 and $32.50. Obviously, the ratios for the Razer Blade 15 and Auris X9 would be a lot better if we could raise the total frame cap above 144. So this just goes to show you that if you want to hit above 100 frames per second in PUBG in a laptop, you're really going to have to pay the premium price. And that's it for this PUBG performance test of these 4 laptops. What game should I do next, and what would you guys love to see reviewed in the future? Let me know in the comments down below. We'll see you next time. Brandon out.